I'm Abren Tenorio, and I am arguing the affirmative side of William Shakespeare not writing his plays. And I am very happy about arguing this side because I really don't believe, after doing researching and background history, after all this, I really believe that he did not write his stuff. The resolution of this debate, like I just said, we're arguing William Shakespeare. So, first of all, I'd like to start with uneducated. William Shakespeare, he was a very uneducated man. There wasn't very many records, according to a source from Oxford Society, that there wasn't many records of him going to school. They had no records of him, and they figured if he was one of the greatest writers of all time, how could he know all that he knew and all the education that he had in his plays and all the smartness that he had if he was never taught all of this? Also, in some of his plays, it is said that he never gave credit to other people when he had reacted or rewrote somebody else's plays. That he had heard a lot of plays from other people, and he would go and tell them to other people, and he never gave credit. So he plagiarized, in other words, other people's work. He always used his name instead of other people's name. I think he would have needed more noble background to his writings, because it is written down that he's the greatest writer of all time, and he didn't have all the education I think he would have needed to write all of his plays. I go to school from kindergarten to 12th grade, and I'm not considered the greatest writer of all time, but he was, and he didn't even go. There's no records of him even going to school. And like I was saying, he wasn't a very high status. Like, he didn't go out in public very much, and I figured, how could he know so much, not going to school and not communicating with people? He wasn't really famous in his own time. Not a lot of many people knew him. You figured he would have been widely known. And I also noticed that there was only 2 actual portraits of him in his time. And if he was such a famous writer for all these plays and all of this, I really think there would be a lot more of him in portraits and everything. It was even said that he couldn't even write his own name. He's going to write all of these plays, and he can't write his own name. Really didn't make sense to me. How much time's left? Okay. There was never ever no plays or poems or even alphabetical letters in his own writing. There's no computers or anything at that time. So in order to make a play, I'm pretty sure you would have to revise and all that stuff. Pretty sure they did that back in the day. And if he did not write it down, how could he remember all of this to put it all into a big play for everybody to see at a theater? I think he would have needed an extensive library in order to write about what he had did. Like I said, he couldn't really write that well. He would need a lot more, just a lot more background information. I don't really think he could have put it all in his head to remember everything and put it down in a play. And his popularity, he wasn't very, he didn't very interact very well with others. I don't think if he never wrote a play down, he'd be able to communicate with other people to tell them how the play is going to be performed or what they're going to say and other things like that. And just to wrap it all, everything up, there's really nothing left behind him other than the plays. There's no really other, maybe like a journal he had wrote down somewhere. I'm pretty sure he would have left something behind if he was such a famous writer, or something about him. He left nothing behind except his plays, which were never even handwritten down in his own name. And that's my conclusion out there, with someone that was so popular and basking in fame, have nothing in his name. I think he'd be, so that's honest. That's why I would have to say that Edward de Vere had actually wrote the plays, and Shakespeare is not the actual writer.
So you guys in 3 minutes prep?
I probably hit it. I think I just like barely hit it. Because that's like I'm what they say. I thought I had the same range.
That's the easy thing.
I said that. So after they, it's mine now. Guys got a minute.
Alright, hi, my name is Josh Mosher, and I'm speaking for William Shakespeare today, that he did write his poems and plays and all that. I believe that he did write because he had access to his books. His dad was like the mayor of the town or whatever, and so he did have access. There was recorded education, so he did go to school and where he learned to read and write. And then, if they say William Shakespeare didn't write the plays, then they're saying the Earl of Oxford. But at the time, the Earl of Oxford was the most self-serving person of his day in England, so he wouldn't give Shakespeare the plays. So Shakespeare would have written them. And that was according to the authorship of Shakespeare plays, where the Earl of Oxford wouldn't have given any credit. And then also, as like a nobleman, they said that most nobles would give their plays away, so they're not in their names. But it would be out of characteristic of him if he did that. Because again, he was the most self-serving person. He liked the glory and all that, and plays. So why would he give him the Shakespeare? Also on all the plays, Shakespeare had a crest, and it was different from the Earl of Oxford, so Shakespeare wrote the plays, and it's on all of his plays. Even though he doesn't have his name down on all of them, it's still his crest. And then another big evidence that we have is that Edward died in 1604. And significant evidence indicate that some Shakespeare work was produced years later, like for poems and plays, all that. So Edward did not write the plays. An example was The Tempest was influenced by a voyage to the Americans, and that did not occur until the 1610.
like Josh said, the Earl was self-served, but he would have had to have been when writing. But with writing plays, as a nobleman, it was really frowned upon to actually write. He would have lost notoriety if he was actually found writing plays and poems and sonnets. So it really wouldn't have been something the Earl would have wanted on his back. And Josh also brought up the point of the crest being in the plays, but the Earl's crest was actually a lion shaking a spear, which gives us a reason to think that he actually used his crest to come up with the name Shakespeare. And his popularity was a big thing back then. As an Earl, he really wanted a good name, didn't want to be looked down upon by others, and just wanted to stay up in the upper class like he was born or he was adopted into. And he had the access to books. What he would have needed was a very extensive library, one that noble people would have had. Josh said that his dad was the mayor of a town, which would have given him access to a library. It would have given him access to a library, but I don't think it would have been extensive enough to actually have learned what he did and to have research to find out everything he wrote about. And also,
Standing meet to the attendance office, please.
there are a lot of feelings and emotions in his writing, which only noblemen would have actually known about or been able to write about. As a commoner, you really don't learn too much about writing. I mean, you learn the basics, but you would have to be noble to actually have learned what he did. And Josh also brought up that the records say that writings were written after De Vere's death, but dates weren't on the plays or poems or anything like that, and so it's really just a theory of when they were wrote. There are no actual dates, so it is still possible that De Vere did write these plays. And also, they could have been found after his death. Is just another thing. So you have to take into fact that once they found him, then they got him out. So, and it was only about 7 years, I believe, that they believe that writings were found after De Vere's death. So with him being undereducated, there's no way that Shakespeare alone, the town Shakespeare, would have been able to write these. You would have needed to have a noble background, which then would have, which would allow him to get educated in the proper way to write as he did. Also, his high status. With being such a high up person, you really don't want anything against your name. It's like politics nowadays. Every little thing that you do wrong is used against you, and so he didn't want anything against his name, which would have, in anyone's eyes, made sense to actually use a false name or give the writings to someone else. But I believe De Vere really did write these plays and poems, and popularity back then, huge deal, and it just made sense. It all makes sense that Shakespeare did not actually write the plays, that De Vere wrote these plays.
Like Dal said, he was a very good writer, but if he was a self-serving person, that he wanted to keep everything for himself. So like, I don't know how he could have wanted to publish anything that he wrote if he wanted to keep it for himself and share it with the world. And not the smartest man, but still could have. Shakespeare wasn't the smartest man, but he could have had some writing still that hasn't been found. Dude.
Alright, like Dallas said, he was, he didn't have that much education, but he says he couldn't have done it for fun, all that, and, because he might have enjoyed writing poems, he might have had it for like, when he was in school, might have got someone that taught him how to write poems. He just made it as a career and went on from there. And like Dallas was saying, the Edward's crest is a lion with shaking a spear, and while Shakespeare is a rooster holding a spear, which is on many Shakespeare plays. Then yeah, like I said, not the smartest man. So, and the Oxford was self-serving. So, I think if he was really self-serving, and the Earl of Oxford would have put his name on the poems, so it wouldn't have been in Shakespeare's name as someone else's. I think Shakespeare would have put his. Wouldn't have gotten it from him if he really did write it. And,
Alright, I'm Abren again, and I'm up here to attack for what Josh and Jordan just came up for. And I noticed, Jordan, you said that he was not a very smart man. He was considered the greatest writer of all time. How could you not consider him one of the smartest guys of his time, or maybe even alive at the point? And I also like to point out that you were not even up here for a minute. That is why I found it so funny that you couldn't even attack and have full evidence about Shakespeare of why we were wrong and why he had wrote his own stuff. You did also say that he had very similar writing to De Vere, and that don't make sense if we're having a big argument about how De Vere and Shakespeare, or who's the real writer behind their stuff, and you couldn't argue for even that 2 minutes of why you believe that Shakespeare had actually wrote his stuff. But that's what I like to say, that just the things I pointed out, what you had just said. Is pointing out that he wasn't very smart, and you weren't even up here for more than a minute.
Like Abren said, was he was not a smart man, but like I said, he could have just been writing for fun, but not really intending it to be famous, and so he didn't put all of his name on his work, because he didn't think it'd ever become famous from back in his time. So that means that someone else could have took the plays as well, and then used them and said that they were theirs. That's what I was saying. He wrote for fun.
To sum it all up in our cause for De Vere actually writing these plays, I'd like to point out that social class would have played a big part of why De Vere would have actually given a false name, or actually given his writing up to allow others to take his fame. And it's all due because of social class. Whether or not he was worried about social class, it really would have played a part against him, which leads us to believe that his class really did matter. And education, with education in mind, it really isn't possible for just some kid out of Stratford to write like Shakespeare did. Would have took a lot of education. And also in the movie watching class, Frontline said that they actually found a journal by De Vere that has similar writing to Shakespeare, which resembled Shakespeare's voice and his characteristics in his writing, which really is the concluding evidence in our case that De Vere really did write Shakespeare's plays, sonnets, and poems.
include this. William Shakespeare did have some education from grade school, so he did have some prior history of learning how to read and write, and his dad was the mayor of Stratford, so that gave him more access to some books to learn how to read and write. So even though he wasn't in school, he still could have learned stuff. And even if he did write, since he didn't go to school that long, he could have things published without him knowing, so that he didn't know about. And that's about it.
Which one do you press? Red one?